The Israeli Knesset just passed a bill banning the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. This United Nations body, otherwise known as UNRWA, is one of the most important relief agencies for Palestinians and is doing much of the needed work in Gaza. To discuss the origins of UNRWA, as well as the politics of space and the centrality of the refugee camp to the Palestinian cause, I'm joined today by Dr Samar Maqusi, an architect and research associate at the University College London. Dr. Samar, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
Let's start with a bit of background about what these refugee camps are, where do they come from, why do they exist?
So, Palestine refugee camps, in short, are the result of the occupation of historic Palestine, which started officially in what we call the Nakba, 1948. And what resulted is a forced expulsion of over 700,000 Palestinians. The expulsion actually did not result in a direct displacement from Palestine into the Near East countries. What happened first is that Palestinians were trying to seek refuge in the neighboring villages. And there are a lot of stories about Palestinian refugees staying in neighboring villages or going to other villages for about 2 years or so. And then as the crisis was getting even more violent, there were more attacks, international bodies came in and they decided that they will start creating spaces of relief and refuge for Palestinians, which we call the Palestine refugee camps. And today, there are 58 officially recognized Palestine refugee camps, but they encompass two periods of creating camps. The first is, as we said, 1948, which is the Nakba. And then we also have the 1967, which we call the Naksa, which also resulted in a secondary displacement of those refugees who were overwhelmingly residing in the camps of West Bank. And they were hosted in Jordan and Syria, which they call emergency camps. So you can imagine that the Palestinians have been sort of experiencing forced displacement multiple times, and they've been creating spaces of refuge multiple times.
I see. And in terms of the discourse around refugees and camps, a lot of people talk about how the Palestinians are the only people who inherit the status of refugee. What does it actually mean to be a refugee?
So this is a complex question because being a refugee has two dimensions. One, there's the legal side of it. So the definition of who is a refugee, which gives you eligibility to being a refugee. And there's the lived experience side of it. So people who are uprooted, they're forcibly displaced from their homeland and their ancestry and their indigenous landscape. They consider themselves also refugees, even if the legal definition of a refugee doesn't apply to them. So the legal definition itself is very much attached to the Palestine camp. But it also is attached to the 1948 Nakba. And so this is obviously something that's contradictory to the Palestinian experience, because a refugee should be anyone who has had to leave his home country because of violence, fearing persecution, feeling death, violent expulsion. But unfortunately, the international community decided that they are going to take a form of legalizing sort of the Palestinian displacement. And to do so, we need to start ratifying what a Palestine refugee means and what a Palestine camp means. So there was a definition for what a Palestine refugee is, but that definition also is unstable, which in a way is telling. It's telling that this is a dynamic violence. It's ongoing. It hasn't stopped. But it's also telling and indicating that the refuge problem is something that is legally reformed, and the right to being a refugee is something that legality can sort of reshape. So, for example, actually, I can give you sort of an example of how that legal language plays around the lived experience of a refugee. So, the definition of a Palestine refugee actually undergoes redefinition, let's say, 7 times.
Wow.
So the very first definition, and which was adopted in October of 1950, and 1950 is the year that UNRWA, UNRWA, which is the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, officially opens its door. It started operating. And they adopted this definition of a refugee. So a Palestine refugee is a needy person who, as a result of the war in Palestine, has lost his home and his means of livelihood. This definition over the years goes reformation and reshaping. And then today, what's adopted and what UNRWA adopts as a legal definition of a Palestine refugee is persons whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period of 1 June 1946 to 15 May 1948. Okay. So you can see they've sort of given a time line of when you are considered a refugee. And it goes on, sorry.
15th of May, is that the...
That's the declaration of the Zionist Israeli state.
People who were expelled after that, would they not be considered?
Under this legal definition, they will not be considered as a refugee. And then it goes on to say, these people who lost both their home and means of livelihood as the result of the 1948 conflict. So I think just to give an idea what this legal language means and how it can reshape in a way the meaning of a crisis or a meaning of a right of return. In the first definition, we had the word needy person. In this last definition, the needy is gone, and Palestine refugees are referred to as persons. So a bit of an abstraction of, the urgency or the need. And then also, in the first definition, it says a needy person as a result of the war in Palestine. And in the last definition, this war in Palestine that was inflicted on the Palestinians is rephrased as the conflict, the 1948 conflict. So there is this sort of abstraction, decontextualization, in a way, of the real crises and the real violence that was inflicted on the refugees.
I see. Could that be a result of the agency attempting to kind of block any attempts by the Zionists to make their work difficult, by not giving the Zionists a point of attack? Had they said, for example, of the Nakba, the Zionists would then go and say, oh, wait, no, Nakba didn't happen, etc. They'll start using their means in, their legal means or their public relations means in order to attack the UNRWA from that aspect. Could it be a political decision in order to make their work on the ground easier?
So we have to understand the United Nations as a body and as an operation, the culture. The United Nations is an international body that was founded by the major powers after World War II, the major powers being the Western powers. The overarching aim of the United Nations is to actually ensure that we don't have devastating large-scale humanitarian catastrophes anymore.
Supposedly.
Yes, unfortunately. What has been on the ground has been, in a way, the opposite. But when that does happen, the UN is ready to immediately go in and provide relief programs. So they're trained, they're funded. They're funded by those major powers. And then what happens if the crisis or the conflict is protracted, like the Palestinian one? The UN is then entitled to attend to those changes on the ground by continuously adopting resolutions to make it feasible rather than rightful and just for the parties to come to an agreed solution. So it is, yes, it's very much a political mechanism but it's also very much a standardized one. So it's to make sure that we can do this in the most feasible, affordable way, whether it's economical or humanitarian or political.
I see.
And this is why we have so many resolutions on the Palestine problem. I remember counting them one time, and I got to 220, and I stopped counting, and none of them have been implemented.
Are these the General Assembly resolutions?
These are the General Assembly resolutions, but they stay so. They stay as General Assembly resolutions because that means they're not binding.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they have to go through the UN Security Council to become binding. Unfortunately, part of the structure of the UN is that it gives those the main members, who are 5 members, I believe, it gives them veto power.
Yeah.
If it gives them veto power, by default, it's politicizing that body, because these bodies are countries who already have their political agendas, their political considerations, their allies in the world. So we can understand that the veto power is not based on humanitarian considerations. It's based on a political consideration.
That actually brings me on to my next question, which is, what was the intent of the United Nations when it built these camps or aided in the building of these camps? Was it completely benevolent, or were there some other aims in mind?
So when the violent war happened in Palestine, I'm unsure if they were expecting this large amount of Palestinian refugees resulting from the conflict, from the war. There was the Red Cross there. So there were some international relief missions existing in the area. And when refugees started pouring out, they were giving the direct relief to the refugees. But then, as the refugees increased in number, the violence was not stopping. And obviously, there was a clear understanding that the state of Israel will be proclaimed. They started then creating bodies that would attend solely to the refugee problem of the Palestinians. Now, I have to mention a couple of things to understand this better. To contextualize the refugee problem more deeply, we have to understand that the region that we call West Asia, or they call the Middle East in the UN, was not divided into nation states when the Zionists started moving into Palestine. It was a contiguous area. It was a contiguous body of land and people and culture and coexistence and economy. So we lived as a solid body in a way. And we had a codependent and interdependent livelihood. And this is why you hear a lot of stories of Lebanese living in Palestine, Palestinians living in Lebanon, before the Nakba, as well with Syrians. You hear about people taking, the train to go study in Cairo from Jerusalem, coming back through the bus. These were flourished areas and regions. Yeah. Then we know about Sykes-Picot. The unfortunate event when the British and the French decided to secretly divide that region. They divided it into nation states. So now we have like 22 Arab countries. And what happened is now we have these new created nationalities. So it's no longer the Arab region, the Arab culture. It's now sort of the Lebanese. I'm Lebanese national, I'm Jordanian national, I'm Egyptian. And this played a big part into what happens with the Palestine refugees and the camps. This is why I'm mentioning it, and we'll explain it better. So once the nation states were divided, then the grounds in a way to create an occupation and create a settler colonial state inside Palestine was easier. Yeah. Because then it could be confined within borders.
Yeah, this is their problem. It's not our problem.
Exactly. Yet, actually, when Nakba happened, the word Nakba, the term Nakba, was actually coined by Constantin Zurek, who is Syrian. And there is a document, تعريف النكبة, أو معنى النكبة, the meaning of Nakba. And in it, he actually describes and explains the meaning as an Arab thing. He mentions the Palestinians, of course, but the meaning, the catastrophe, and the helplessness was described in Arab terms, in a homogeneous collective term. And this, in a way, shows that we were still in transition. We still considered ourselves as one region, as one problem, as, So the violence that happened in Palestine, in effect, was happening for everyone in the region. All right, so we go back now to 1948. There are refugees, hundreds of thousands. Where will they go? Now, practicality plays also a role. As I said, they tried to go into other towns and villages in Palestine. Unfortunately, the massacres were just proliferating, and destruction of villages was also increasing. There were more than 600 villages completely destroyed in a very short period of time. So even when they go to a village to find refuge, that village is then destroyed or attacked. So they just kept moving and moving and moving. And what happened is the Palestinians who live in villages or areas in the north would then seek refuge in what is now Lebanon and Syria. And then people who live in sort of south and east would go into Jordan. And then you have the uniqueness of Gaza, that then a lot of people also went into Egypt or resided along that, those geographies. Because we have now nation states and we have a refugee problem, a body has to be created to manage this problem in what is now sovereign states. And this is why the UN decided to create what we now know UNRWA. UNRWA was not UNRWA from the beginning. UNRWA was the UN, the United Nations Relief for Palestine Refugees, UNRPR. It became UNRWA, and what the difference is, as we see, is the letter W, which designates works. And this is very much telling. It was a UN agency for the relief, and because of the context I described, which is we have nation states, they're newly constructed, so they're new economies, they need labor, they need a lot of funding into programs of economy and works. UNRWA became, in a way, the agent through which we designed these works programs. We have huge bodies of refugees in dire need of work and in dire need to build livelihoods because they've lost everything. So these could, in a way, become the labor bodies. And that's pretty much what happened in those Near East countries.
So would they provide then cheap labor for these newly established states?
It's not necessarily about cheap labor. It wasn't a class problem.
Okay.
It was much more about how do we turn an urgency of a refuge problem that should be resettled into one that can become an economic integration. So how do we, little by little, depoliticize the refugee problem, remove the urgency of it through this need for livelihood, for economic flourishing, and for the need for work, simply. And slowly, that would let the refugees reintegrate in those host countries, build their own livelihoods. So it's not necessarily about cheap labor. It's more about how can they build livelihoods, and by so integrating naturally into the new environment and not necessarily have to implement any right of return or address the political crises.
How did these newly developed states interact and react to the existence of the refugees within their borders? I know, for example, the Lebanese government dealt with things differently to the Jordanian government.
Yes. So it's also a very complex history because I don't think the host countries necessarily had the intention of absorbing the refugees to depoliticize and to eliminate the right of return. But I think we have to understand the geopolitical history and its progression, the powers that were at play at the time as well. And so a lot of decisions also changed as time was passing and the Palestinian refuge was protracting. In essence, there was an economic survey mission that was actually sent into these near countries before the camps also were created. And what they did is they surveyed each nation state economically and pretty much put out a plan, an economic plan on how to also make these nation states flourish. So you can understand each nation state is now sovereign. So they need their own infrastructure to provide for the people, for their livelihood, for their economies. At the same time, they're now directly implicated in this refugee problem because they're hosting these spaces we call camps. Now, what that, in a way, it's forced because no one wanted a refugee problem. No one wanted an occupation, a Zionist occupation in the region. So when it became a reality and there are refugee camps, each host country had to put in policies. And this is because these refugee camps are not normal spaces, they're political spaces. And these camps are actually, to this day, they're not spaces owned by the government. They're spaces that are actually there are some of them owned by the government, but overwhelmingly they're private lands for Arab people. But they were drawn up, divided, and they were given as a right of use to UNRWA.
Right.
And there's a contract of renting the camps from UNRWA by the host country to UNRWA for 99 years.
Okay.
So we're reaching, in a way, we're getting closer to the expiry of the contract.
Yeah.
And bears the question, what does that mean legally for the camp?
Wow.
But the camps are a right of use, so it's not ownership, which means it's also a very much, it's an alive, dynamic political space, which needs to be addressed with policies, and it needs to be addressed with regulations. It's not a normal urban space. To this day, camps have now become so densified. Some of them call them city camps. And unfortunately, because of the genocide in Gaza, a lot of people have been able to now see what camps look like. They're, towers and blocks of cement. They're very dense. Those are refugee camps. Yet in every shelter, in every block, and in every apartment in that block, it's not owned. It's still deemed right of use. So it's still deemed a political space associated with an article that says you have the right to return. So a political solution is always pending. And this required that there needs to be policies and regulations. Now, we have to understand that each country now has the ability to make their own policies and regulations. So now they have their own considerations for their own nation state. And so they have also sets of considerations towards the Palestinian problem. So this is, in a way, the first moment of disengaging the Palestinians from the Arab sort of homogenous geography. So it's now becoming a relationship between a Jordanian host country towards Palestinians, a Lebanese towards Palestinians, a Syrian towards Palestinians. So this is the first moment of rupture, in a way. And yes, each country had different policies. So Jordan is considered to have, in a way, the most welcoming or, in a way, it assimilated the refugees most. So it gave refugees passports. But even that's not for all refugees. That's for 1948 refugees and refugees who came from the West Bank, then to Gaza. There are refugees who don't have Jordanian passports. So there is always, different segments of how these policies also apply. At the same time, Jordan, by doing so, has allowed the Palestinians to be part of the civil force. They can take part in government force and work. They can own property and such. That doesn't mean that it's made the life in a refugee camp easier, because by default, camps are segregated, they're bordered. So there's a lot of hardship and a lot of segregation towards a camp life or a refugee life. And until today, they're socially stigmatized. There is a word that, oh, he's a refugee or he's from a camp. An Arab would understand that. So that's very unfortunate, but that's very much a spatial way of doing so and applying so. By contrast, Lebanon has, in a way, the hardest and unfortunately, in a way, most challenging relationship towards the Palestinian refugees. The Palestinian refugees in Lebanon have been banned from working in the professions of the state, 72 professions, I think. So they cannot work. They're not part of the civil workforce. So really, you're limited to pretty much labor force. They're also banned and prohibited from owning property in Lebanon. So you're confined to the camp in terms of building your livelihood and in terms of finding an inhabitation or habitat. So it becomes very confining, very difficult, and I would even say in many instances quite violent towards the Palestinian refugees.
I want to get onto the makeup of these refugee camps in a bit, about how they're constructed. But before that, obviously, 750,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes in 1948, a further 300,000 in 1967. It seems, or at least it seemed, that the refugee camps kind of were a central aspect of the Palestinian struggle. But then in 1993, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the de facto representative of the Palestinians, agreed with Israel to establish a state on 22%, I think, of land of historic Palestine, in which case the vast majority of these refugees would then be, I assume, have to give up or at least postpone indefinitely their so-called right of return. How important is the refugee camp to the Palestinian struggle, and how has that evolved? The importance, how has that evolved over the years?
So we need to understand that space is a very political materiality, and architecture is a very political tool. And as we discussed, the camp moved into many different historical meanings and phases. And after the Palestinian Liberation Organization left Lebanon in 1982, the camp, as a site of armed resistance and as a site of mobilizing the liberation of Palestine from the camps into Palestine, subsided. So the camps became different spatialities. And what resulted from that is that the host countries then started having a different relationship towards the camps. So the camps were no longer seen as active sites for resistance, but they remained as spaces that could erupt at any moment, because camps are spaces of people who have been forcibly displaced. It's always connected to that first moment of violence. And everyone realized the insistence of Palestinian refugees towards the right of return and self-determination. So then spatial politics comes into play. How do we deal with camps that are still existing, that are still bounded spaces, that are political, but deal with them in a way that is not necessarily calling for the complete destruction, doesn't need complete destruction, but at the same time, we depoliticize and we weaken the camp. So, for instance, in Jordan, what they've been doing is they've been launching a methodology or an approach of reorganizing the camp. And this is, in a way, a very much urban methodology or approach to neighborhoods. So when neighborhoods become too dense and contiguous, That means there is a lot more connectedness with the people inside that neighborhood. The same thing with the camp. There's connectedness. There's quick access from one shelter to the other. So it becomes a very strong spatial space, and the stronger it is spatially, this in a way, the stronger the resistance and the stronger the people who are resisting inside that spatiality. So what you do is you want to break that spatiality. And the way it's been done in many camps in Jordan is the Jordanian government goes in and starts building these main streets in the middle of the camp, thus dividing the camp into two separate entities. So you've interrupted the spatiality and the social connectedness of the refugees. And what that also allows is that the gendarme tanks, for instance, can easily now penetrate and enter the camp. So, for instance, if there's a demonstration, which many times could, in a way, become violent in the sense that a lot of the refugees will burn tires. They're going to increase their voices of anger towards their oppression, and also sympathy and empathy with what's going in Palestine. And that's always a sign of a security threat for the host governments. So now they're able to easily enter the camp through these widened roads, where before they were not able to. So that's a methodology that's been implemented in Jordan. In Lebanon, unfortunately, it's a more violent approach. And this is also because the Lebanese camps are much more dense. They're much more organic, and some of them are literally towers of cement, like Ain al-Hilwa or like Burj al-Barajne. So the Lebanese context saw a lot of camps completely destroyed. So in many ways, like what we're seeing in some examples inside Palestine. So it's a complete flattening of the camp. And then the idea is to discourage or even forbid the refugees from returning to that camp. So it's no longer a camp. And that body is completely disintegrated. So spatial and social body is completely disintegrated, which means resistance weakens and weakens and weakens. At the same time, and this is the last example was Nahr al-Barid camp in Tripoli, in north of Lebanon. It was completely leveled within a very short period of time, because the story is also very complicated, but there was the existence of a militia of 100 or less men in a space where tens of thousands of refugees have been living. And to get rid of these 100 less men, it was completely leveled. Oh. So there are a lot of, in a way, theories around why was there the need to completely level a camp. There are other mechanisms to also, to get rid of. Now, it's being rebuilt because the refugees insisted on going back to their camp. Because usually the story has been, there has been like 6 camps completely leveled or completely destroyed in Lebanon, some by the Israeli forces. The camp is not rebuilt. What happens is the refugees leave that camp and go integrate in other camps. So the Nahr al-Barid camp had a very different story. There was a lot of activism, and they returned to their camp. Yet what happened is UNRWA, through the grassroots of the refugees, was also forced to negotiate with the Lebanese government to rebuild the camp on that site. But the Lebanese government demanded that the camp adheres to new spatial dimensions. So if you look at an image of Nahr al-Barid camp before destruction, there's such tiny pathways and alleyways, which doesn't allow a car to go through. Now, the narrowest pathway is 4 meters square, and then you go from 4 meters to 6 to 12, thus allowing tanks and military personnel to easily enter the camp. So the camp is now being reorganized as security sites in a way, because if anything erupts or if the camp becomes actively political or active in resistance, it's very easily stopped, and it's very easily in a way toppled. So this is the methodology of now spatially redefining the camp and to try and, in a way, reintegrate it into the geography, not as a political urgency or urgent space, more of as an urban space that can easily then just integrate with the surrounding spatiality, because it becomes looking more like the surrounding spatiality rather than an intense urbanity and scale.
Jumping off that point about how the host countries attempt to deal with so-called resistance or disturbances from these camps, you mentioned that these camps, in a way, birthed kind of the modern form of resistance in the Palestinian struggle. How has resistance evolved over the years within the camps?
So resistance very much responded to the speciality of the camp, actually. When the Palestinian Liberation Organization was in Lebanon, they were enabled because there was something called the Cairo Accords, which gave sovereignty to camps and gave recognition from the Lebanese government towards the camps as sites of resistance and launching armed resistance and the intent to liberate from Lebanon. This meant that the camps could build up, because before then, materials going into the Palestine camps in Lebanon was forbidden. You had to get a permit. You had to go through very arduous processes to get a bag of cement into the Palestine camp.
Wow.
Yet refugees always find mechanisms to do so. So the camp was always building up. So when things were eased, and the recognition that the camps are central sites for resistance, and also, as I said, it's an Arab problem. This is, it's not just a Palestinian problem. So, things were sort of in flux. You had periods where the camps were enabled and periods where the camps were completely confined and disabled. So, and this has to do with the geopolitics and, with many complex considerations for each host country. That is hard to explain and, just simply. But with the period that, let's say, the camps were enabled, the camps became built up. Cement was pouring into the camps. And the PLO had this idea that we'll build up the camps, we'll ease the mechanisms through which the refugees can build their livelihoods. That way they can focus on resistance. And then you had, all of a sudden, these camps become spaces where cement towers exist. Now, that helped them a lot because the camps, as we said, were targeted. And the speciality of the camp decides how actually conflict unfolds. So, for instance, in one of the periods of violence in Burj al-Barajna camp, these forms of cement towers and interconnected buildings allowed them to avoid being on the ground, because being on the ground in any conflict is very vulnerable. And this allowed them to actually build, in a way, pathways on the first, second, third, and fourth level, thus having these pathways above ground to where they can access the whole camp, but not be a target and not be exposed on the ground. And these methodologies were also used in Gaza and in the West Bank. Now, as time also progresses and conflict continues, the methodologies change because those inflicting the violence will also respond to the speciality of the camp. For instance, Israel they built in the Naqab, they actually built life-size cities and camps within that urban speciality, and they train their military and soldiers into how to deal with that speciality. And one of the things that they used, I think, in Balata and Nablus, it's called walking through walls. So because the speciality was so complex, and they didn't want to, in a way, use the methodology of completely leveling it, what they would do is the soldiers would start blowing holes into the walls, and they would just start walking through the shelters. So no pathways. The camp just becomes, this sort of plastic or bubble, and you just blow holes in the walls and you go through, and gives them this easy access. So On both sides, mechanisms develop alongside the speciality of the camp. Now, what's happening with the Palestinian resistance, what changed is that because there was more and more violence used as a methodology, and we saw in 2002 in Jenin camp, the whole center was blown up, the resistance also developed along those lines new methods. So instead of using the vertical dimension, they now use the vertical dimension up, they now use the vertical dimension down, so beneath the ground. And these are tactics that are historically used, but obviously to each context and to each liberation movement and resistance movement, they're applied differently or they're contextualized differently. But this is how speciality is directly involved in how the resistance and the mechanism also is shaped and characterized.
We've seen in the last 12 months the complete destruction of several towns, cities, the entire area of Gaza in the genocide. Obviously, this includes a lot of refugee camps. And this isn't the first time that this has happened. It's never happened to this degree, but we've seen in 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, massive destructive force used against the civilians of Gaza. But they've rebuilt before. Do you believe that after this genocide, they can rebuild again?
This is very different. Yes, Gaza has been destroyed many times before, and refugees are very accustomed to rebuilding their spaces, and they're very intelligent in space making and understanding space. They're resilient in how they find mechanisms to also use local materials or innovate within the means that they have to build up space. But this also says Palestinians insist on living and insist on having a livelihood. Yet, this time around, it's a complete erasure. So it's not only just erasing camps or inflicting damage on camps, it's an erasure of life. And this is, I think, the mechanism that we see that's unprecedented, I think, even in history, of completely erasing any fabric of material living or human living, humanitarian fabric as well. And also not allowing those who survive to find a way to rebuild in any form possible a habitat. So not only have they destroyed the cement fabric, but even when people have been, in a way, trying to survive through constructing tents and habitat through these temporal materials, those have been also destroyed and hit. So there's an insistence in Gaza on complete elimination, not only of life, of the possibility of life afterwards. Now, your question about how to rebuild. I like that you actually use rebuild and not reconstruct, because I think what's happening in Gaza is not only concerned with Gaza. It's a wake-up call to the whole region, and it's a wake-up call to the globe. To the region in terms of reminding them that this is a regional problem. This is a regional existential crisis. It's not just about Gaza. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, I believe, when he came out of Gaza, he was sort of repeating this warning that it's Gaza, then it's West Bank, and then it's Lebanon, and it could be Jordan, and it could be Egypt. And unfortunately, this is what's unfolding in front of our eyes. And we're one people. We care about each other. And so this is a wake-up call for all of us to think about this question. How do we want to rebuild this region? How do we want to live with each other as Arab populations and as one culture and one language and one history that has been shared and is still being shared? And we need to think about it beyond material terms, about can we just rebuild Gaza with infrastructure and such, which has become almost an impossibility because they're saying to remove the debris needs 10 years. This is a debris mixed with nuclear and chemical material, debris mixed with human remains. it's something unprecedented. So the possibility of this rudimentary, spatial reconstruction is not there. But in many ways, this gives us the opportunity and the urgency to think about this idea of what do we build from Gaza on? And this needs a conversation, a wide-ranged conversation in the region, but also the globe. Because what's happening in Gaza is breaking every moral rule, every moral understanding, every human rights law, regulation, and this has shaken the globe. This is why you see so many people in the hundreds and thousands and millions going to the streets. They're associating with Palestine because it's touching human morality. And we need to also think about how do we build a moral place, a moral humanity, to where we all adhere to, so that people can not only live safely and freely, but they can coexist as such. No one should be living at the expense of another person's blood. And unfortunately, the past century has been pretty much constructed on that notion. And Gaza is a wake-up call to the whole globe. And we can only do it together. So Gaza should not be seen or discussed through the terms of reconstruction. It should be discussed through the terms of morality, in the terms of liberation and self-determination is a universal right. So not let alone to the people who are natives and indigenous of that land. But I'm hoping that this will be the first step towards also rebuilding the connectedness of the region as one people, one livelihood, and one area of this beautiful, diverse coexistence that has always existed in that region and will continue to do so because people are inherently moral and inherently peaceful and inherently insisting on living in a peaceful, loving way of life together. So I think this is exactly what we need to be focusing on.
Dr. Samar, thank you so much for your time. It was incredibly eye-opening to hear what you had to say, and I hope we can repeat this conversation again.
I hope so as well, and I hope we're going to see peaceful and better days for humanity in the coming days. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.